Hello, my lovely anatomists and physiologists. Michele Glass here, and welcome to another Chapter 6 video. And here we're looking at the gross or large-scale anatomy of the long bone. So I have a photograph here of a model from our lab. Hopefully you are recognizing this as the tibia. The tibia, remember, is the medial bone of the leg. And the leg, remember, anatomically goes from the knee to the ankle. So as we take a look at this bone, we can begin by labeling the long part of the bone, or what we've probably called before the shaft. And this shaft has a new name. We refer to it as the diaphysis. On either end of a long bone, we have what's called an epiphysis. And so let's label here our proximal epiphysis. And the only reason I'm labeling it here as proximal is just to help you with your orientation and to practice terminology. So remember, proximal means closest to the attachment point. So that would be our knee end. So long bones will have epiphyses, which is a plural word for epiphysis, on both a proximal and a distal end. And so let's label down here our distal epiphysis. Distal meaning furthest from the attachment point. So in this case, that would mean the ankle end. Okay, also important to note, you have sort of this section of bone where the epiphysis meets the diaphysis. And we talk about this in a few ways. So we can call it the metaphysis, or the term middle. Meta means middle. Now, if the bone is still growing, I'll say if it's still growing, then we're going to call this the epiphyseal plate, as in growth plate. Or instead of using the word plate, we can use the word cartilage. So if it's still growing, we'll call it the epiphyseal cartilage. If it is, let's say, fully mature, meaning elongation has stopped, and depending on the bone we're talking about, and depending on the human, we see that our skeleton becomes mature somewhere in our mid to late 20s. With our long bones kind of achieving that full maturity, usually I would say mid-teenage years. And there is a difference in whether you have estrogen or testosterone in terms of reaching that fully mature length. So if the bone is fully mature here, we can also talk about this area as epiphyseal line. So epiphyseal line indicates that growth has stopped and there's no more cartilage in that area. So we can talk about this area circled in pink as the metaphysis, or we can use the terms epiphyseal plate to indicate growth is still occurring, or the term epiphyseal line to indicate that growth has stopped. Now, we also mentioned in our last video about the difference between compact bone and spongy bone. And so it's important to note that the diaphysis is lined by compact bone. It's important to note that the epiphysis is on the outside covered by compact bone. It's also important to note that inside the diaphysis, we have a space called the medullary cavity. And we'll see the medullary cavity is going to be lined by spongy bone. And we'll see that the inside of your epiphyses, so actually both ends, is going to have spongy bone. Now, taking a look at this picture here, what we're seeing here is a photograph of an actual remnant of bone. This is something that we have in the lab. It's not a human. And I think what we're looking at right here would be the distal epiphysis of femur. And if the stories are correct, this is from like a cow graveyard. So this is maybe a piece of cow bone. So what we're able to see here is our compact bone on the outside of both the epiphysis and the diaphysis. But then in this case, we're seeing the compact bone being worn or chipped away. And that allows us to see the spongy bone that's going to be located underneath. Right here, we're starting to see the diaphysis, which is our shaft. And so inside the diaphysis, so if you're looking up here, or if you're looking at this view here, we're seeing the medullary cavity. So in this case, we're looking at the shaft that's been severed, and then we're actually looking like up inside that severed shaft in order to see that medullary cavity. And notice that the medullary cavity here is full of that spongy bone. It's lined with the spongy bone, I should say. It's not full of it. The medullary cavity has our yellow bone marrow. Yellow bone marrow. The yellow bone marrow, remember, is our fat storage. Is our fat storage marrow cavity. Whereas our epiphyses, the spongy bone of our epiphyses, have our red bone marrow. And our red bone marrow is the location for what we call hematopoiesis, which, remember, is the formation of blood cells. So we've taught before about one of the important functions of the skeletal system is to provide this location for hematopoiesis. Now, as we continue looking at the gross anatomy of our bone, we are going to see some important connective tissues. Now, of course, the entire skeleton is composed of connective tissue. Bone is a connective tissue. Cartilage is a connective tissue. Your ligaments are connective tissues. And so the whole system essentially is composed of connective tissue. But what we're going to see is wrapping around the very outside of the long bone, we have periosteum. And then lining the very inside of the long bone, we have endosteum. And so these tissues are going to be really important. When we look at the periosteum, it's this outermost lining. It's very fibrous, so that's given us a lot of strength. And then it has this intercellular layer, which is going to contain those osteogenic cells. We've talked about them as being stem cells, or we will talk about them in the future as being stem cells. And we'll see it also contains the osteoblast cell, which is going to be important in building new bony matrix. So the periosteum has this really strong fibrous layer, but then also this layer that contains osteogenic and osteoblast cells, which we'll have a whole video about that. When we talk about the periosteum, this outermost layer, it's important because it provides a pathway for blood vessels, nerves. And this book is really great about helping to reinforce pretty much anytime we have blood vessels, you have lymphatic vessels. They're essentially in parallel together. And we'll talk about that more actually in anatomy part 2. The other significance of the periosteum is that this is where you're going to have ligament and tendon attachment. So ligaments, we will see, connect bone to bone. Ligaments connect bone to bone, and as such, a ligament is part of the skeletal system. Tendons attach a muscle to bone, and as such, a tendon is part of the muscular system. So a ligament is a connective tissue that attaches bone to bone, and it's woven into the periosteum. Tendons are connective tissues of the muscular system that attach muscle to bone, and it's woven into that periosteum. So this is very strong, very important connection. The other significant connective tissue to point out here, again, is the endosteum. And this is our innermost layer. It's going to line all of the spongy bone. Remember, you can imagine spongy bone as a lattice-like network. So you have, something that looks like a sponge, right? This is how it got its name. And so all of those extensions of bone will be wrapped in endosteum. Any kind of space in compact bone, such as central canals, foramen, canals like we labeled in the skull, all of these openings and passageways will be lined with endosteum as well. Again, as we look at the endosteal tissue, we see some important cell types. So we're going to see primarily osteogenic and osteoblast cells located here in the endosteum. Notice that's what we mentioned was part of the periosteum cellular layer as well. When we talk about these other cell types that are labeled, the osteocyte is the bone cell, and so we see that it's located actually in bone. And when we talk about these osteoclasts, we're going to talk about them as mostly being found on the bone surface. So where the endosteum is layering directly on the bone, then it makes sense that we're seeing this osteoclast as sort of here on the bone surface, almost looking like part of the endosteum, but a little bit separate. The only other tissue to label here would be the articular cartilage. And articular cartilage is going to be a modified hyaline cartilage. And it's going to be important in our joints. So we'll see on the long bone, it's completely covered by periosteum with the exception of the joint surface. And the joint surface will be covered in articular cartilage, which is helping to reduce friction and also functioning as a shock absorber. We also need to take just a few minutes to think about a flat bone because we were looking with the other descriptions of long bones specifically. When we think about a flat bone, I like to think about it as a compact bone, spongy bone sandwich. So I'm thinking about compact bone as the 2 slices of bread and the spongy bone layer as the innermost layer, the deep layer. So let's label it here, deep layer, meaning it's the innermost layer, or like the peanut butter of the sandwich. In our book, this layer is also referred to as diploe, diploe layer. As we think about the compact bone, spongy bone, compact bone sandwich, we should place our periosteum on the very outside. So let's go ahead and keep this sandwich analogy, and maybe that is the I hate to say it, the plastic wrap around the sandwich or the Ziploc bag around the sandwich or the reusable container, which I like to say around the sandwich. Remember too that the endosteum would still be wrapping. Let's make a note. Our endosteum is still wrapped around your spongy bone and lining, I'm just going to say collectively like passageways of the compact bone. And remember, that's talking about both central canals and any perforating canals and any additional structures. The last little thing to talk about are bone markings, and really this is covered more as part of our lab work. So we're going to see that bone markings are significant because they indicate places of articulation, and articulation is talking about where bones join to bones. So that's essentially a joint. We also have bone markings that are projections. These would be things like tuberosities, tubercles, protuberances, trochanter's. That was the word I was trying to pull from my mind. These projections, points that are sticking out, are going to be important points of attachment for tendons. Remember, tendons are attaching muscle to bone. Tendons are part of the skeletal system. Excuse me, oops. Tendons are part of the muscular system. So projections are attachment points for tendons and for ligaments. And the ligament is part of the skeletal system. The ligament is the connective tissue attaching bone to bone. And then the last kind of significant marker that we pay attention to in our lab work is the hole. And so these, are those foramen and canals and so forth. And these are openings. These can be grooves. These can be notches. These are going to be allowing for blood vessels. These are going to be allowing for nerves. And let's go ahead and remember our lymphatics here as well, lymphatic vessels. All right, that's it for this video. Stay tuned for the next. And as always, take care of yourselves and each other.